episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. I am your host, Austin Render. Thanks for joining us and downloading, watching, listening, however you're taking in our podcast. We really appreciate it. Our numbers have been incredible here for the offseason. I can't wait to see how this thing takes off throughout the actual season of basketball, which is just a little over a month away from now. Reminder, most of our episodes, the Iowa one, not available on YouTube, but every other episode is available on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. We are a part of the Back Home Network podcast network, which is brought to you by Home Field Apparel, Apple and Spotify, also where you can find all of our podcast locations. Like them, subscribe, download, give us a rating. That kind of stuff really helps us. We still have 5 more previews to do. I promise we will get through all of the teams here. If you're an Ohio State, Purdue, Washington, Michigan, Maryland fan, we are working on those. We're going to get those previews out. And November 4th, obviously the start of the season, we're going to have a podcast on that opening day of the season. So it should be fun. We'll get you everybody previewed between now and then. Today's episode will not be a preview episode. Today will be kind of a recap on what we saw last week from the preseason All Big Ten team selections, as well as some predicted standings analysis, see how our voting fared compared to where it all kind of cookies crumbled. One Big Ten news and notes before we jump into the show. We will have a Big Ten Media Day, Wednesday, October 2nd. We're going to hear from all the teams. Unfortunately, not quite in the budget of the Dribble Drive to do live podcasting up in Chicago, but we will certainly have some reports from what we hear from the teams. That's, again, this Wednesday, October 2nd. Going to hear from all 18 teams, head coaches, and select players as well. If you want to see a full list of who is attending that, you can go to the Big Ten website, and they've got all the players and who will be speaking in what order and all that good stuff on the website. So, again, that is Wednesday morning from Chicago for Big Ten Media Days. And as I mentioned, preseason All Big Ten team came out. The rankings came out. So I thought this is a pretty good time to have a show about that. And joining me is the voice of Michigan State women's basketball, Dalton Shetler. Dalton, thanks so much for joining us, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Austin.
I appreciate you joining us, and always fun to talk some women's basketball. And we have stuff in our hands now, preseason rankings, preseason All Big Ten people. So where do you want to start? You want to start with the players or the team rankings?
Let's go. You know what? I think rankings will help launch us into the players. So let's
okay,
start rankings.
I like that idea. So let's do preseason Big Ten rankings. If you're watching us here on video form, I'm going to throw the rankings up here on the screen as we talk about them. But number one, I don't know where you laid out, and I'm going to be pretty transparent. You don't have to be, but I'm going to tell you what I voted. But USC was my number one. That's where they landed. The LA schools, it's a toss-up. I mean, they're both really, really good. I threw USC at number one just because of the firepower they have at the top of their roster. Is that kind of where you set out with USC as well?
So far, step in step, hand in hand, Austin. Because I think the LA schools are the best. I mean, coming in too. I mean, you're talking about 2 teams that are going to be in the top 5 nationally when the season starts. And to me, like, you're right. Like, you can kind of go either way. You start with Juju Watkins, and I'll lean on that. And that puts me at number 1 for USC.
Yeah, I wrote in my notes Juju plus Kiki plus I think the underrated one is Talia Van Olhoffen from Florida State. That is a really good addition for them. Those 3 together is going to be a tough trio to beat for this season. So I think a fair number 1, probably going to be preseason number 2 overall in the country. I would assume they'll give South Carolina the nod at number 1. But would not be shocked if you see USC at number 2. Another team I wouldn't be shocked if they're in the top 5 nationally is UCLA. They come in at number 2. I would assume you're right there with me. The LA schools coming into a new conference, and they're just gonna be 1 and 2 at least preseason.
No, I am with you. And what's amazing to me too is just when you talk about how good the Big Ten, the conference has been as a whole in recent years, all the amount of teams, the amount of bids they've gotten to the big dance, the NCAA tournament, and then you add in the likes of USC, UCLA, who were automatically starting off at 1 and 2, joining this Big Ten conference after a historic stretch. And then there's Oregon and Washington, who could maybe even be fringe teams of those bubbles, like as with aspirations heading into the year. I mean, when we look at it, I know we're talking about team rankings for now, 18 teams you're looking at probably 9 or 10 of these maybe making the NCAA tournament,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is just unreal.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right. I think, and we had Charlie Cream on. Highly recommend going back and listening to that episode. He said it's very possible to get double-digit teams out of this conference, and right now he does have 10 teams in his projections, and that's without Oregon and Washington maybe taking that step forward. So they compete to be an 11th team. Maybe somebody else doesn't, and they move in. But I do think 9 is like the minimum amount of teams this conference is going to get in. So if your team finishes 6th or 7th in this league, it's not a bad thing. You're going to be very capable of a Sweet 16, Elite 8 run in the NCAA tournament because of how deep this conference is. I truly think there's going to be a ton of teams in this conference that are going to be 5 through 8 seeds in the NCAA tournament. They're going to have to go on the road that first round, and you're not going to want to play a Big Ten team in your home place in the second round of the NCAA tournament. I'm just saying it now. This conference is going to be as deep as we've ever seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know it. Your team went on the road last year. Went to South Carolina. It's tough to be on the road, but also you're a little free because like the pressure's off. You're the road team. Like go play, lose, right?
Well, absolutely. And that season last year too for Michigan State was just a magic carpet ride of no expectations with a new coach, losing some of your most productive players from a season ago, losing 3-4 players to season-long ending injuries. Yep. You had a rotation of 7 players, and none of them were taller than 6'2". And he just went out and balled, finished 4th in the Big Ten. It was an unbelievable year. So, I mean, talking about the carefree, like there was a lot of that when Michigan State got there. They just ran into a North Carolina team and could not battle on the boards with them. And now they're going to seat one of those Tar Heels again because Deja Kelly transfers from North Carolina to Oregon. That might even be part of our conversation later on with the players.
It absolutely will be for sure. And I think Michigan State's a good example. Finished 4th last year. Let's say they take a quote unquote step back and they're 6th or 7th in the league. That could be just as good of a season as last year with how good this conference is.
And from bumping into some people and talking ahead of the year, that's kind of been what I've said too. Like, look, if you finish 6th or 7th, picture that being 4th place like last year. Like it's because of how top heavy USC and UCLA are, because of how deep everything is and the grind you're going to have to go through. Look, honestly, if you finish in the top half, we mentioned you're probably going dancing. Like there's a lot to be pretty proud of if you're able to finish above 500 in the league this year, which hasn't always been the case. Like normally you want to be in that top cut at that leading edge of the Big Ten, but now because of how deep it is, it affords you some grace with that.
Okay, so there's 1 and 2. We go on a tangent. We're going to go on many tangents today, so just bear with Dalton and I as we talk Big Ten women's basketball. USC 1, UCLA 2. Now we get into the pre-Big Ten, the conference that existed before the additions. And the defending champions come in at number 3, Ohio State. This is where I had them. The transfers, they haven't played a single game for Ohio State, but could be home runs for this Ohio State team. You're looking at Chance Gray from Oregon, Aisha Petty from Kentucky, and Jelani Cambridge, one of the top 2 or 3, depending on what rating system you look at as a true freshman, could be as good as it gets in the Big Ten Conference as a freshman. She's going to be an instant impactor. And, Cody McMahon's still there. Taylor Theory is still there. They've got some depth. They've got a ton of pieces, and Kevin McGuff is still their head coach with a great staff. They put good teams together. The press continues to be havoc for other Big Ten teams. I had them at 3. I think this is the spot that a lot of people had them. The LA schools number 1, 2, and Ohio State, a team that can certainly contend with them.
No, I think you're right. You used the word firepower earlier. When you go through the influx of talent between McMahon and Theory coming back and then all those newcomers to the Buckeyes, it's hard to argue with. I had them at 3 as well. I thought this was the last team I felt sure of when writing up my ballot. I got to 3, and this was the exact same order as you. And then, honestly, from 4 to 10, because we fill out our ballots all the way through 18. What gets published is just 1 through 5. But 4 through 10, I mean, seriously, I might as well have flipped coins. Like, I do not feel necessarily confident in any of the teams in the pecking order when we keep going through here.
I actually went 1 through 3, and I think I did like 12 or 13 to 18. Mm-hmm. And then I worked on that middle, and I was like,
I did the same thing.
I don't know what to do with these teams, man. There's so many teams that could take another step forward. And it's in a good way. It's not in, oh,
Yes.
man, some of these teams, I can't decide which one's going to be worse. It's which one's going to be better.
Yeah.
And I will tell you now, as we head into 4 and 5 here, my tiebreakers tiebreakers were coaching. To me,
Okay.
I'm taking a coach that I believe in, that has the track record, that has churned out good teams. And that is why I agreed with number 4, which was Maryland. Maybe the best coach in the conference, certainly one of the best coaches in Brenda Freeze, is retooled and ready to go. A completely new Maryland team, with the exception of Bree McDaniel and Cheyenne Sellers and a couple of other role pieces, but they bring in just a new team full of transfers. I mean, you're talking about, let's make sure I get all these names right here. So they've got 7 transfers in this. Kayleen Smichael, a headline from Rutgers, I think is a really big addition. They bring in players from Gulf Coast State, Virginia, Arkansas, Villanova. This is going to be a new look Maryland team. It could not work. It could pan out that the transfers don't gel. And that's the thing about the transfer portal, is we are totally hypothetically saying it's going to work. But I think when I look at the talent that's on the roster and the coach that's manning the sidelines, I said, you know what? I think Maryland could have that. I just don't see them having another year like last year where it just didn't quite click.
And I think that's totally fair. So naturally, when I do this, especially when we get to kind of like what you use for the word tiebreakers, I go by the things we're sure of. And you're right, we're sure of Brenda Freeze, but I knocked Maryland just a couple points in splitting hairs because of the transfers. Just a little bit wary of how it all comes together.
So
I
many
think you're
question
right.
marks.
Yeah, and it very well could be that they finish 4th place or maybe even better. I have a hard time seeing Brenda Freeze having back-to-back not Brenda Freeze years there in College Park. So I'm with you. I think Cheyenne Sellers is one of the best players in the conference. We'll obviously talk a little bit about her later on, but I had Maryland at 6.
Okay.
So I knocked them back a couple.
Okay.
I actually had put, and this is where I ended up off with the rest of the media and the coaches. Because
it was just you. You're the only one.
You're right. And like I said, honestly, like I can hear the argument for Maryland and I could even jump on board with it. But I ended up putting Nebraska at 4 because like we talk about leading with some of those sure things. Alexis Markowski's back. And you talk about some of those underclassmen that started to play so well at the end of the season for Nebraska. I actually threw the Huskers at 4.
Okay.
But like I said, you could talk me into any team really at that spot.
I'm glad we don't agree, because that wouldn't be as fun if we sat up here and we said the same 5 teams. we need some differing.
Right.
But I mean, Alexis Markowski, Natalie Potts, Logan Nisley, Callan Hake, all coming back. Allison Widener comes back from injury. Go back and listen to our episode with Nebraska, or about Nebraska, because with Matt Coatney, because Allison Widener is a big part of this team. That she's been battling a lot of injuries. We don't totally know exactly what her status is, but if she is able to go, she's a big addition for Nebraska to be back in the lineup. Britt Prince is a really good freshman there. Could start right away for Nebraska. You're right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with putting, and like we said, 4 through 11 is a total toss-up. So Nebraska could absolutely slide in there at number 4. I had Nebraska at 6, so I think we flipped Maryland and Nebraska there.
Yeah, we did.
I like Amy Williams. I like her, and I think her track record of getting teams to the Big Ten, or to Big Ten tournament titles, and to like the NCAA tournament is there. Can they take that next step? That's what I'm waiting for in Nebraska, and we've been waiting for it for a couple of years now. Is can they go from that 6, 7, 8 seed in the NCAA tournament to a potential host team? And I tell you what, Pinnacle Bank Arena would be on fire if that's a host school. That is a great arena full of great fans. So that's, to me, the next step for Nebraska is, can they contend for a host school? The Jazz Shelley loss is a big one. I think Britt Prince will help that, but how quickly will she help that is the question, being a true freshman. But I have no issues with that reversal from you and me there from 4 and 6. But does that mean we have 5 the same? That's
I'm guessing we don't have 5 the same, and this might be even more dramatic of a difference in the previous. I'm thinking.
Okay, you go first.
So at 5, I did not get it with the media and the coaches because 5 ended up being Indiana, correct, for
It
both?
did, yes.
So I put, again, using the logic of things that we're certain
I
of,
know who
we're
you're
sure
going
of.
with here. Yeah.
And you can call me Homer, but I did go with Michigan State here.
Oh, okay, okay. I thought you were going to go
And
Illinois. Okay.
no. So, well, and I think if you're doing the concerns and question marks about Michigan State, you may have a little bit of trauma from seeing Illinois in the second year under Shauna Green when we had such high hopes with the same core backfire a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Michigan State's got a little bit different of a roster this year, but they bring back Julia Aralt, who was second in the Big Ten in block shots. She was averaging 15 points a game. She was averaging 7.5 rebounds a game, and all playing as the center. And she won't have to do that this upcoming season because in comes Grace Van Sluten from Oregon, who also was averaging 15 points a game, 7.5 rebounds a game. Like, you have almost a clone of Julia Aralt, but an inch taller. And they're going to be playing that 4-5, the high-low game together. You bring back the 6th player of the year in Theron Halleck. There's a lot of pieces, and I'm not even touching the rest of the roster yet, but I believe that Michigan State will be able to push for that spot. Now, again, like I said, 4 through 10, you can talk me into about anything. You could have talked to me Michigan State a little bit lower. You could have talked me to Illinois being here. Illinois I actually put just after Maryland, so I had the Illini at 7. With that roster coming
So
back.
we're gonna have to fight here over the Hoosiers, is what it sounds like.
Yeah,
he's burying them. He's throwing them back.
Well, so I think you're different than what I'm thinking with Michigan State. So where do you have the Spartans?
Okay, so I have actually. Let me make sure I get this right. I had the Spartans in at. Okay, you're gonna hate me. I had them at 9, but
9?
Again, to me, it's splitting hairs. It's like Illinois, Nebraska, Michigan State, Indiana, Iowa. To me, they're all capable on a neutral court of being a 50-50 toss-up.
Agreed.
And my worry with Michigan State is the Illinois worry. And I don't think that's fair to put that on a whole nother program, but that is my worry. And it honestly, with Purdue as well. Purdue did the same thing as Illinois. They went to the NCAA tournament, brought back a big chunk of their people, and it didn't work out either. So I am a little concerned, but I do like Robin Freilich and what she did in year 1. And I even wrote in my notes here, falling to 9th is not as much about Michigan State getting worse as it is the conference getting better. That is what I wrote down. They are still a tournament team in my eyes, just a team that's going to be battling in the middle of the pack with all these other schools.
Yeah.
So
again,
a lot of it's going to be schedule based too. I mean, it's going to be who plays who where, like who plays who twice. That kind of stuff matters in terms of the standings, but in terms of talent, there's so much in the middle of the Big Ten.
No, and I think we both agree with the caveat. Like, and it's not just cliche because 1, 2, 3. I mean, we told you we felt pretty confident about that top, but honestly, 4 through 10, you could talk me into anybody at any one of those spots. So I think we agree. Like, we're talking about legitimately splitting hairs. It's not just a cliche. But like we said, and my logic had been for tiebreakers, going with things that I'm certain of. I'm certain in Alexis Markowski. And I'm also certain that there's less back to the basket posts. It feels like this upcoming season with Mackenzie Holmes departing from Bloomington, it feels like there's going to be some territory for Markowski to work. I'm confident in Julia Aralt and Theron Halleck and those certains. And then from there, like I put Maryland at 6, like we talked about. I'm confident in Cheyenne Sellers. I like the talent there. I only put him at 6 because I haven't seen the talent play together yet. So like that was my logic in how I ended up putting them through this pecking order. But we haven't gotten to your 5. Was it indeed Indiana?
It is Indiana. I'm thankful that we did not agree because this is good for all the fans at home, for their respective teams, to hear us, the 20-minute mark of this podcast, still detailing 8, 9, 10 teams that we could have put in the top 5. This is great. If we walked on here with the same 5, and folks, we did not talk about this before the show. If we had walked on with the same 5, that would have been pretty boring, and we would have touched on 5 teams and moved on. I had the Hoosiers at 5. Again, to me, it's coaching. I trust in Terry Morin. She has proven that every single year they continue to do something they haven't done before the previous year. You could argue that 22-23 was or 23-24 was a downtick in terms of going from a 1 seed to a 4 seed, but they still made it to the Sweet 16. And I get it. The number one concern with Indiana is you lost Sarah Scalia, you lost Mackenzie Holmes. That's your two top leading scorers. I love the addition of Shea Chesky. I think she's going to slide in really well into that Sarah Scalia role as a knockdown shooter, able to spread the floor. Defense is going to be the part that we're going to have to see her improve upon. The other part I love about Indiana is they did not lose anybody to the transfer portal. So they lose Scalia, they lose Holmes, and Ariel Wisney, a bench player, and that's it. They bring everybody else, almost everybody who played significant minutes is back. I got to go to practice for the first time once they started practice up, and Lily Meister looks incredible. Obviously, everybody looks good in practice, but I am excited about Lily in her increased role, and having Mackenzie Holmes on staff as a graduate manager, I think will help with that as well. Caroline Striplin, a great addition, going to play very physical at the 5 position from Tennessee. And then you just have the constant presence of Chloe at the top, Sid on the wing, and Yarden on the wing. Yarden can play any position. She's a very malleable player, and I think she's ready to take a big step forward. So, yes, I put my IU hat on just for a bit, put them at 5, but I guess I wasn't alone because they did end up on number 5 in the media and the coaches poll. I trust that Terry Moore, and it sounds like it's going to be a different type of style of play. They're going to have to play differently than they've played for the last 5 years. And even going back before that, you had Kim Royster, Amanda Cahill, some other really good 5s. And Cahill is going to be more like what Lily Meister is, but they're going to play differently. They're going to play more 5 out. They're going to play spread you out, run the floor, be a little bit quicker. I think Chesky helps with that. I think Meister helps with that. So I do think that, I mean, again, on a neutral floor, Indiana versus Maryland, Michigan State, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Minnesota. It's a toss-up in any of these. If you play any of these matchups in the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis, it's going to be an incredible theater. But I just gave Indiana the edge, and I gave Maryland the edge because I believe that Terry Moore and Brenda Fries are 2 of the top coaches in this league. I trust that they will get this thing figured out.
And I think that's completely fair. And what's interesting to me, too, is kind of the outsider of Indiana looking at the Hoosiers, and you see the potential there. Like you said, Shea Chesky coming over for Penn State. And if listeners or fans don't remember, she had a 40-point ball game for Penn State last year. Like, she is a sharp shooter. She could step into that role. I think Chloe Moore-McNeil is one of the more underrated players the conference has. But I'm also been a huge fan for a while now of Yarden Garzon's game. I think with her height, her length, her ability to move and shoot, I think she presents such a danger. Honestly, I thought last year she would have taken an even bigger step than she did. Not that she was bad, but I just see the potential in Garzon. And I think if Garzon takes that step this season, that launches Indiana to that 5 spot pretty nicely. Like I see the potential there.
Yeah, and Yarden had a lot of stuff going on off the floor last year with everything that's been going on. So there was some there, and I think she's ready to take that big step this year. I was talking to some of the folks at practice, and I think this is a team that could truly have 4 or 5 players averaging between 10 to 14 points a game, but nobody like Mackenzie, who averaged 20, 21, 22. It's just going to be a bunch of players that average double figures, low double figures, because that's just what it's going to be, I think.
And by the way, I did want to offer a clarification. When I said back to the basket bigs in the Big Ten, it was mainly about like elite back to the basket bigs, since you brought up Mackenzie Holmes again. I wanted just to clarify that. There are still back to the basket bigs, but there aren't too many more Mackenzie Holmeses out there.
No, there are not.
Alexis Markowski is kind of that person for the upcoming year. Since you brought her name, it brought me back.
Markowski and Betts are probably the top 2 you think about when it comes to back to the basket bigs. And the other part I will throw out is I think the bench for Indiana is going to be as deep as it's been maybe in Terry Morin's tenure at IU. You have Lexi Bargesser coming off the bench, Lene Beaumont and Juliana Lamendola coming off the bench. Caroline Striplin will come off the bench, or Meister, whichever one doesn't end up starting. So there's 9 right there that you can go. Indiana, it was part of the issue maybe 2 years ago when they ran into Miami, was these players are playing a lot of minutes. They weren't very deep that year. I think the depth could really help. All right, so you had Michigan State at 5, Maryland at 6, Illinois at 7.
Correct.
So then 8, 9, and 10, I'm guessing, is some mixture of Indiana, Iowa, and Minnesota?
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly
But
correct.
where were your 8, 9, 10? And then we'll move on.
So I went, and again, I mean, we're talking about a lot of coin flips, but I put Iowa 8.
Mm-hmm.
Lucy Olson coming in, and if they try to run a little bit of copycat, like, look, nobody can really copycat Caitlin Clark, but Lucy Olson might have some potential
Yep.
to do some of the things there. So I put the Hawkeyes 8, I put Indiana 9, and I put Minnesota 10. And again, I could see Minnesota finishing 5th or maybe even pushing for 4th, but I have them at 10 starting here.
Yeah, Minnesota's a team for me that I like the upside. They could
Yeah.
finish as high as 5th or 6th in the league, but I could also see like they were very Mara Braun dependent last year. And
Yes.
obviously that one big injury took them down, and all of a sudden they're playing on Wednesday at the Big Ten tournament. So to me, did that depth establish last year while she was gone? I think it did. And I think that's why they could be ready for a big step this year.
And I think in the first year under Dawn, Dawn was like, look, she's got a great track record. She's a great coach. And she
Mhm.
knew that in a lot of these games, Minnesota didn't necessarily have more talent than opponents. And they made it a low possession game,
Mhm.
executed at a high level, and grinded out some wins. Like that was the style they played. They might need to do some of that again this year, but they executed at such a high level for a first year coach that it really impressed me. And I could see how far they could climb in the Big Ten.
Yeah, they bring back a ton of talent from last year as well. So I go Indiana 5, Nebraska 6, Iowa 7, Illinois 8, Michigan State 9, Minnesota 10. And again, you could throw those truly in a blender and come out in a lot of different orders. For me, Nebraska, Alexis and Potts is such a good combo there to bring back. Rip Prince, so good. I think Nebraska, like I said, has the potential of being a top 4 team of the Big Ten, maybe a hosting school if they have a great year in the NCAA tournament. Iowa, obviously, I think a lot is talked about with Caitlin Clark. They're not just replacing Clark. They're replacing Kate Martin. They're replacing Gabby Marshall. They're replacing Molly Davis. I mean, that is 4 of your 5 starters and your longtime head coach in Lisa Bluter. Now, I think it helps that Jan Jansen has been on staff with Lisa Bluter step for step the entire time. But that is still a change, and there is still probably a fair adjustment period necessary for that. I think there's still a tournament team. I loved what we saw from Sydney Falter down the stretch in the Big Ten tournament and the NCAA tournament, stepping in for Molly Davis. All I've heard is good things about Taylor McCabe and what we could see from her this year and in her three-point shooting. And obviously we talked about Lucy Olson, Hannah Stuelke. That's a good 1-2 punch there as well. So I'll be curious to see how Iowa looks. Rob Brooks was on the podcast, and he said he thinks Stuelke could play more at the 3 or the 4 this year than the 5, which I think would be an interesting mismatch opportunity for Iowa, getting a smaller player on Hannah Stuelke and allowing her to stretch the floor a little bit more. Illinois at 8, everyone's back again. I'm cautious because we saw this last year. Everybody was back, and I know Makaira Cook dealt with some injuries early in the season. I think Genesis Bryant might have as well. So maybe there's going to be some more health and they'll be better out of the gates. That's the key, is getting out of the gates better. Illinois was not good at the start of last season. I love Kendall Bostic. I think she's one of the more underrated players in the league. And so I'm curious to see how they pan out. I still think they're a tournament team. Again, we talked about Michigan State and Minnesota at 9 and 10. Oregon's my dark horse outside of that, sitting at 11. That's another team with a ton of transfers that we don't know much about in terms of how they're going to play together. So that could certainly, and Kelly Graves is a great coach. So I expect him to put something together there out on the West Coast. But we won't get into 11 through 18. But let's talk players. Unless final thoughts on where we stand with all these teams.
Well, I just wanted to recap. So it's funny. So 1, 2, 3, and 10 we're in sync with. 4 and 6 we flipped. 5 and 9 we flipped, and I think 7 and 8 we flipped. So that's about right. I think that's about right though. Like I think
if we released all our ballots, it would look like a jumbled mess.
Yeah.
From 4 to 10, it would just be everybody would be ranked somewhere different on everybody's ballots.
And if Michigan returned Layla Filia instead of her transferring to Texas, I mean, we'd be talking about 4 through 11. I think a lot of us, Michigan's going to have a couple of freshmen come in and play really, really well for them, but I think we're all a little bit cautious and have knocked them back past that 10 spot. But if Filia was back, mean, this gets even a little bit more broad.
Exactly. Yeah, Michigan's an interesting one because obviously Kim Barnes-Arico, one of the best coaches in the league, but they are kind of rebuilding with the loss of Filia as well as a lot of their grad transfers that they had in last season that got them into the NCAA tournament. All right, let's talk preseason all Big Ten team. For the first time on this podcast, I'm going to share my screen and see if we can make this work here because I've got them pulled up for if you're a visual learner. There we go. Nope, I didn't do it. All right. Well, that's good.
Feels like
there
watching the teacher in class. Oh, there it is.
Hit the right button. If you're a visual learner and you're watching us on the Back Home Network YouTube channel, there you go. Hannah Stuelke, Lucy Olson, Cheyenne Sellers, Alexis Markowski, Cody McMahon, Lauren Betts, Kiki Rice, Juju Watkins, who was the only unanimous selection, Kiki Iriafen, and Sarah Williams. I think it's a little crazy that Juju Watkins was the only unanimous selection. However, she was the preseason player of the year. People expect her. So that wasn't surprising that she was unanimous. I was surprised that others on this list were not unanimous. But, I mean, there you got 2 from Iowa, 2 from UCLA, 2 from USC. That's 3 teams right there. Only 7 of the 18 teams represented on this list. Now, that is one of them. There's also, if I pull up the media, or no, this is the coaches one. Makaira Cook on this one as well. There was a tie there, so Makaira Cook gets on the coaches list, so 11 players on that one. So that's where that came out. You and I, we worked for teams that did not get represented in this. Right. I thought, and now I'll be transparent, I voted for Chloe Moore McNeil on the All Big Ten team. I get it. I understand it. But I still think, and in my heart of hearts, she is a top 10 player in this league. But again, there are, like you and I were talking about before we went on this podcast, 18 teams. It's hard to narrow it down to 10 people.
Well, and especially because we're talking about 2 teams that are top 5 in the country. Mm-hmm. Ohio State's probably around top 10, top 15 nationally. And then we talked about already with the Big Ten, you could go teams 4 through 10 as being legitimate contenders to be at least top 5 in the conference by the time this ends. So you're talking about already 10 teams. And if you took one player off each roster and left it at that, like you still wouldn't get the back half represented. Yep. But also, like you wouldn't get a couple of Trojans on there, or a couple of Bruins on there. It's a ridiculously hard thing to filter down, way harder than it's ever been.
Yeah, you're just thinking if you put, I mean, looking at this list, you're looking at Indiana, Michigan State, Minnesota, that are potential tournament teams not represented on this list, which is crazy. But that's where we're at, and the talent and the depth of this league is as deep as it's ever been. So I'll say my difference is I had Makaira Cook on mine. Obviously, she made the coaches, did not make the media one. I had Mara Braun on mine, and I had Chloe Moore McNeil on mine. I put Mara Braun on there simply because her impact was seen by the drop-off of Minnesota last year and how good they were pre-Mara Braun injury and how much they struggled post-Mara Braun injury. I felt like she deserved a nod. But again, it's not as if these people didn't deserve a nod. Right. But yeah, I did not have Kiki Rice, Sarah Williams, or Hannah Stuelke on there. Kiki Rice deserves to be on there. There is no doubt about it. I was personally trying to spread the wealth among more teams in my top 10, but I totally get Kiki Rice. She's as good as it gets at the guard position in this conference.
Yeah, and actually, I did the same thing with Kiki. And Again, I don't even know if it's the right call, but I did want more teams represented, like on the ballot than what when I started with the 2 Bruins and 2 Trojans and I had 6 spots left for everybody else.
Yep.
Look, I mean,
I could have seen going 3 teams of 5 and letting 15 people get on there. Then we could have dished out some more honors, but yeah.
I just, and I mean, you could argue with the logic, but that was the same logic that I used too. I mean, I just wanted it to be more represented because there's so many great players. I had, and again, I'll go back to Michigan State, Julia Aralt, because usually when I start these ballots off I go back to last year's All Big Ten first team. And Julia Aralt was All Big Ten first team last year. And again, I'll offer up the context again that she was second in the Big Ten in blocked shots. She averaged 15 plus points a game. She averaged 7.5 rebounds a game, about 3 assists a game. And this was a rotation of 7 players. She, before that year, had been playing the 3 or 4 position. And she became the tallest player on our team after we had Mary Menn go down with injury, Isa Alexander go down with injury. And so you had a 6'2" Julia Ayrault and said, hey, you've got to battle Mackenzie Holmes in the post. You got to battle everybody in the post. And then you also have to be our offensive generator. And she did all of it. And so with that context, I thought, I think Ayrault deserves it. And I think, again, that 1-2 punch of her and Van Sluten this year is going to be pretty dynamic for Michigan State. I did have Sarah Williams on there. I heard you say you did not.
I did not.
Kind of with your Braun logic, and honestly, like maybe we're just substituting on our ballot Braun for Williams. But Williams, I don't know what Wisconsin would have been if Sarah Williams wasn't on that team last year. Like I don't know how many games they actually win. Like Sarah Williams really determined a lot of games for them. So, and that's kind of the same logic you use with Braun. So I think we're kind of there. Honestly, just about everything else was in step. I didn't have Hannah Stolke on either. But I did put Lucy Olson on. I just thought 20 plus points a game was hard to ignore coming from Villanova. But
it is interesting how many of these players did not play in the Big Ten last year.
I know. Well,
obviously the LA schools, even then, Kiki Uriopin's a transfer into USC, but there's 4 players right there that didn't play the Big Ten. And then you got Lucy Olson, who did not play in the Big Ten. So half of the team is new to the conference this year.
Well, and like when I was doing it, and this may be a little bit hypocritical too, but like Deja Kelly transferring in, we're talking about having 15 or 16. I was like, well, we still got to see it in the Big Ten, but I didn't say that with Lucy Olson. So hypocritical is fair.
Yeah,
to slap me with.
I considered Deja Kelly was up there for me. I mentioned I didn't put Kiki Rice, Sarah Williams, Hannah Stolke on there. Julia Ayrault was absolutely toward my really hard to keep off the list players. Genesis Bryant as well. It's hard for me with Illinois to go Makaira Cook and not Genesis Bryant because I think they're in tandem. And I think that hurts sometimes in the recognition because they are in tandem and they do so much together. They feel like a package deal. I didn't put her on there, but I considered Yarden Garzone as putting. I wanted to put a Hoosier on there. I went with Chloe because she's more impactful just in the general sense of the game, an all defensive team member, a triple-double last year against Michigan State. But she's so good and so in charge of a really complex offense. I also thought about Kayleen Smeichel from Maryland, but you would have to go 2 years back really to see that production that she had at Rutgers. And to me, that's going too far back and kind of projecting too much. Destiny Adams, someone else that had great numbers last year for Rutgers. Part of the Sarah Williams thing for me, and this may not be fair, but I do put winning a little bit into the equation. And I do put your team has got to be impactful in the conference. And sometimes Wisconsin was not last year. I think they are primed to be better this year, and they are going to be a really tough out this season. But I think with Destiny Adams, with Sarah Williams, with some of the others, it's hard for me to put you on such an exclusive list for not being one of the top tier teams in the conference.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. I mean, like we said too, and this is similar to our conversation with the rankings is we're splitting hairs. I mean, I said before the podcast, and I think you had said we got down to about 15 or 15 plus that were deserving of this and had to try and trim deserving players off. And that was tough. But
I made my initial list and I think I had 20, 22 players on it. I was like, oh boy.
Got to somehow cut this down. But you had mentioned too, with Kayleen Smeichel, that it's just too far going back, especially when we're talking about how competitive this list was. What's an interesting thought to me is because I didn't do this necessarily with the thought of what it'll be at the end of the season. I went with what it's deserving to be today when we did it. But if we did like projections of who we thought would be there at the end of the year, mine would, I think, look a little bit different because look, I give Julia Ayrault a lot of credit. And April's going to be in the conversation for this again at the end of the season. I truly believe. But Grace Van Sluten is going to be there for Michigan State. And I think there's several of those players around the league that we're not talking about enough yet, but we're getting ready to learn are going to be huge difference makers and stars in this conference.
Yeah. Talia Van Olhoffen, I think, is another one at USC that I think. And I think Deja Kelly at Oregon is somebody that, like you and I both seem a little hesitant to put her in there right now. But maybe by the end of the year, Oregon's a tournament team, and a lot of that is due to what she did. And that's 100%. certainly possible. I'm trying to think of, I mean, you think about like Illinois. I mean, Kendall Bostic. Maybe she comes up with just an incredible season, a double season again for her.
I'm glad you gave her a shout out too, because Bostic is a walking double, and we don't talk about her enough.
No, she was in my players considered for a little bit there because I value what she does.
It's so consistent, I don't know if
too. She doesn't get enough credit for what she does.
I mean, she just rolls into the gym and walks out with 15 and 10 or whatever. Like she is so consistent and dependable, but whatever.
Just a wonderful rebounder. Yep.
Yeah, we agree.
Yeah, just tracks the ball very well. So USC are preseason favorites. Did you go Juju Watkins as your player of the year as well?
I did. I had a hard time. I mean, that as hard as this ballot was to put out, that took me 0.5 seconds to figure that out.
That was just finding Watkins on the scroll down menu was all that any of us had to do there. I think that was fair. I'm just curious, like, we look at this list, if it's not going to be Juju Watkins, if somebody else is going to have a breakout season that trumps Juju Watkins, which I think is going to be tough, not only with her play on the court, but the media attention that she garners. I think somebody like Cody McMahon has the upside of somebody who could do that. And I think Lucy Olson, I think Kiki Rice has that ability as well. I think you have to, in some ways, be flashy. I think there is a little bit of the popularityness to it, whether that's right or wrong. I do think you have to be somewhat flashy and attractive in the sense of your basketball game to watch to be able to win that award, especially to top someone like Juju Watkins.
Well, and I'm thinking about it from this regard as well. Player of the year, traditionally, if it's not on the Big Ten champion team, it's a top 3 team in the conference. So, and if we go with that theory, I mean, we see it at being USC, UCLA, and Ohio State. I think you can narrow it down to that selection where then you're talking about a Cody McMahon. You're talking about maybe if Chance Gray puts together a wonderful year for the Buckeyes, or Lauren Betts, Kiki Rice of UCLA. Like, I think those are your real contenders. It actually would be an interesting case study to go back in time and see when the last time a Big Ten player of the year didn't come from a top 3 finishing team in the conference, because it just seems and feels a bit off.
Yeah, that's a good, well, I mean, you got to go back at least 3 or 4 years to get past Caitlin Clark being a player of the year. But I'm also curious if, and we'll end on this, if I think Kiki Iriafen is not getting the love that maybe she would have had she been on Stanford, because I think she's being swallowed up by the Juju Watkins-ness of this all. And Kiki Iriafen, if she were on a different team in this conference, they would have been 1 and 2, and maybe they still are in some people's eyes, 1 and 2 for player of the year. She's a potential number 1 pick in next year's WNBA draft. And her game is as good as any. I think it's kind of crazy because she went from being behind Cameron Brink at Stanford and kind of being overshadowed by her to now transferring into, I don't want to say the shadow of Juju Watkins, but now second best on her team again. And that is one of the best players in college basketball in Kiki Iriafen.
Well, and it kind of reminds me, as you were talking through it, of Monica Sinano. Remember a few years ago at Iowa, Monica Sinano was a 2,000 career point scorer, and Caitlin Clark had all the attention. And it just, I mean, that was kind of the way it worked. But Kiki finds herself in a bit of a similar position. And I think, too, to your point, look, I've watched a few of the games because I try to watch as much as I possibly can between Big Ten women's and men's basketball, and then expand to whatever else is going on in the country. So I watched some Stanford last year. I watched some Kiki. But I imagine a lot of people haven't been able to watch Stanford when they play late at night last year and don't know too much about Kiki's game. Like
Yep.
part of this too is we're all going to be introduced to how great some of these players are.
Yep.
Like Kiki Rice is going to have the opportunity to really wow us this year because she's going to actually be in front of us more. And that's I mean, when you talk with like some of the ADs, especially from those institutions, that was one of the big selling points for why they wanted to be in the conference, was so that they could have some exposure and accessibility, because some of these players, I don't know if people have been able to watch yet. Yeah. And I remember actually, speaking of the ADs, talking with Martin Jarman, the UCLA athletic director, and asked about that exposure and how big of a deal it was, if he could put it into words. And he goes, we sat there last year and watched as the NFL playoffs were getting ready to start, and heading into the playoff game right before it was Iowa women's basketball and Caitlin Clark. And we're like, look at this. It's on Legacy TV, this women's basketball game. And we're on the Pac-12 network and nobody knows how to get it. Like nobody's able to see our games. So they just a side conversation of the exposure and accessibility now for these players, how great they are. That's a big plus.
It's huge. And there are so, like, it's not like we're adding 4 teams that are going to fill the middle of this conference. We're adding 2 championship caliber teams, 2 teams that are certainly capable of making the NCAA tournament in Oregon and Washington. And this is going to be fantastic to watch and see how this all unfolds. Dalton, I think this is officially the longest Dribble Drive podcast that we've had. I was like, okay, we'll do preseason, all Big Ten preseason rankings. Maybe we can talk a little bit just general. And then here we are at minute 47, just rolling here. So I hope the fans, I hope we touched on as many teams as we could there, players, etc. I hope fans enjoyed that, because it's always fun as you get ready for the season to hear your team and your players' names mentioned for lists like these. So I know not all the players made it on the official list, but they made it on the Dribble Drive podcast list of mentions. So there we go. We'll add that to their list of honors.
I was going to say, and I suppose we dribbled the clock out then. That's what we're going with.
Yeah, we did. That's a good call. Good call. We, instead of doing a dribble drive, we just dribbled at the top of the key and spent all the time. Dalton, it was great. Thanks so much for hopping on. I'm excited to get this season started. I know you are too. And we've got lists in our hands and things to talk about and debate. No matter whether we're right or wrong, we get to at least talk about these things. And we're about a month away from the start of the season. So Dalton, thanks so much, man.
Thanks for having me, Austin. Can't wait.
Well, we will continue to put these out each Monday as we head toward the start of the season, November 4th, which happens to be a Monday. We'll have a show on that opening day. We'll continue our previews next week. I believe Maryland is our next one in store for us, so we'll continue on with those every Monday at 7 o'clock on the Back Home Network YouTube channel, and then podcasting on Apple and Spotify. Remember to download, leave a review, let us know. We'll be back next Monday with